I'm still narrating my book, The Life of Dominion, and now we're in chapter 3. I've called this Identity. When God created mankind, he made them male and female. They were given a mandate as well as power to fulfill that order. One of the powers he gave was the ability to reproduce themselves. So every person who was ever born was the creation of a man and a woman coming together in procreation. The person created was in the image of the two who created him, and the two who created were the offspring of another set of two people, a man and a woman. That is the only way a unique human can be created. Our first parents, who created a number of children, violated one of the critical rules that God had laid out. Our first parents, who created a number of children, I already said that. I'm sorry. It was a rule. Let me say it again. Our first parents, who created a number of children, violated one of the critical rules that God has laid out. It was a rule that stood at the crux of all that was relevant to the lives of his creation. It was a simple rule. It was not a burdensome rule, but it was at the very heart of man's destiny and his ability to fulfill his purpose. Man is not God, and he must draw his life from God, or he has no life, just existence. The man was given a test, and the test answered a question: who was the man going to believe? The sad story is recorded in the Bible, as well as the punishment for failing the test. Man who had sweet fellowship with God and great promises that made his life eternal as well as rich and full was driven to a place in the earth that required that he till the land and provide his own sustenance by the sweat of his brow and the anxiety of his heart. He was no longer heavenly. He no longer had immediate access to God. He was now an earthly person, and all he created was earthly as well. That is why all mankind is earthly, of the earth, and identifies with the earth and with the world. I mentioned in another chapter that God sent prophets to us for 4,000 years. Those prophets revealed many things, many mysteries, but the greatest mystery of which they spoke was cloaked in dark sayings and dim pictures that were hard, if not almost impossible to understand. This mystery spoke to something of another day, a day when the curse that man was living under would be broken and men could return to their original state, and even better. Now remember, this chapter is called Identity. So, the promise of which the prophet spoke was to be a change in our identity, the very core of who we are. You do not need any other evidence than that which is readily available to prove that the man of the earth, which is referred to as the natural man, does not have power to exercise dominion in his life and in the world. Yet, he longs for dominion, though he may not use the word dominion. The only man who has true dominion is the heavenly man, the man who is joined to God and has the resources of God in his life and in the world, a new identity. God kept his promise of breaking the curse that man has lived under almost since his creation. The simplicity is this: 2,000 years ago, a virgin gave birth to a man in Bethlehem, Judea. Angels were in attendance. He was fully man, and his identity was as a man under the curse. However, it was God who sent the Holy Spirit, God's life, into the young woman's womb. God was the father of that man. So while his body was of a natural man under the curse, his inner man was the same as God. He was a man of heaven. He lived on the earth for about 33 years until the time came for him to fulfill the plan of God, the same plan that the prophets put forth in dark shades, but is now fully revealed into the light. Jesus, the name of God's firstborn Son, is that man. He exercised full and complete dominion over his world while walking on earth. He taught and empowered his disciples to follow him. He turned water into wine when it was necessary in order to continue the wedding reception party. He controlled the wind and the rain when those elements were hindering him in his work. He healed the bodies of all who asked for healing, and many who did not ask for healing. He healed insane men by driving the devil from their spirit. He fed 5,000 men and their families by multiplying a couple of fish and a few loaves of bread. When he needed money to pay taxes to the government, he sent one of his disciples to a lake to catch a fish in whose mouth was a piece of money. He forgave the sins of souls who were burdened down by the failures in their lives. He taught people how to live. He had complete dominion. His body was of earth, but his soul and spirit were from heaven. He proved that men who are born of heaven have power and full dominion on the earth to represent as well as please God. But in the fullness of time, it was planned by God, Jesus was delivered up to evil men who were jealous. They were religious men, jealous of his power, who wanted to continue controlling the people with their religion. They lied about him to the civil authorities and in turn nailed him to a wood cross, the method of killing criminals in those days. He was buried. He was laid on a slab of cold stone in a cave. A large stone was placed over the cave's entrance, but his spirit left his body and descended into the lower realms of earth to preach to the disobedient souls from the days before Noah and the great flood. His soul descended into hell, where he confronted the devil and took from him the keys of death and hell, with which he had ruled over man since man was expelled from the garden. On the morning of the third day of his death, his spirit and soul re-entered his body in the presence of angels. Then he emerged from the grave, fully alive. He was seen by over 500 people. As a note on Satan, Jesus did not destroy Satan. He destroyed his power over men who live in dominion as he did. The day will come when Satan will be fully destroyed. The lake of fire is reserved for him and his angels who followed him. Jesus spent the next 40 days with his disciples, teaching them the mysteries of the kingdom that they needed to know to fulfill their mission of spreading the news of his life, death, burial, and resurrection. He ascended into heaven as they watched him go. They were told to wait in Jerusalem until they received the fullness of the promise that the prophets had written about. While his disciples looked on, again in presence of angels, Jesus ascended into the air, and his natural earthly body was changed into a heavenly, eternal body. He entered the heavens and marched into the throne room of God, his Father, and took his seat next to God. God welcomed him and handed him the scepter of all authority. God told Jesus to take complete control, heaven and earth, and build his kingdom in the hearts of men. Once complete, Jesus will present it to the Father, and God will be all in all. The disciples waited, fasting and praying. There were now 120 people gathered together. 10 days after Jesus ascended to heaven, there came into the room where the disciples were gathered a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and each were filled with the same Holy Spirit that Jesus was born of. The inner man of each of the 120 was immediately changed. They all began to speak in a language called tongues by the Spirit of God. They who were born of the flesh of their mother and father were now born again of the Spirit of God. They were now men and women of heaven, sons of God. You can read about this in the Bible in Acts chapter 2. And this is the mystery that the prophet spoke of, and that was promised by God. All who will believe with their heart that Jesus rose from the dead and confess with their mouth that Jesus is Lord will receive the Spirit. They will be saved from the natural man and be born again as the spiritual man. That person will have the power to exercise full dominion in their world. Let me say this. Knowledge is like a room behind a closed door. Knowledge is not for swelling the head with information. Knowledge is to be participated in. It's to be fleshed out in the daily life. The door must be open, which is what I'm doing with these videos. We must also enter the room through the open door and step into the room. The knowledge we receive must be acknowledged, accepted, and believed, which will motivate us to assimilate that knowledge into action. If you'll do what those 220 disciples did in praying, believing, and waiting for the gift, you'll receive it, and you will know you received it. There's a record of the lives of those disciples, They went into the entire world telling others about Jesus, healing the sick, forgiving sins, and generally exercising dominion in the world. The power did not die out with them. There are many people in the world today with the power, but having the power and exercising the power are two different things. In video 2, I told you that faith is necessary for receiving from God. It's also necessary to exercise faith in the things of dominion. We'll speak more of that later. This is the transformation I'm revealing, and this is the destiny of which I am speaking. Continue on to video 4 for more.